She made the prediction in front of 4 people, and not one of them thought to stop her. What the record shows is this. In the winter of 1914, a stout Polish woman named Otelia Gburek, known to everyone on her block as Tilly, sat down at a neighbor's kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee without being asked, and told the woman across from her that her husband would be dead by Thursday. She said it the way a woman might announce the end of a season, flatly, without visible grief, without the performance of reluctance that terrible news ordinarily requires of the person delivering it. The neighbor, a woman named Anna Wachowski, said later that she had believed Tilly. She said she had believed her because Tilly was not the kind of woman who said things she did not mean. He died on Thursday. The Chicago Tribune would eventually call Tilly Klimek. She took the name of her 4th husband, and it is the name under which she appears in every legal document from 1923 onward, the Poison Widow of Little Poland. But that designation came 9 years after the first death, when the newspapers had enough bodies to count and enough surviving witnesses to quote. In the years between, she was simply a neighbor, a Polish woman in her mid-40s who had been unlucky in husbands. She attended Mass at St. Mary of Perpetual Help on Damen Avenue. She cooked for the sick, her own sick, which is to say she cooked for the men she was poisoning. She remarried after each death with a speed that her priest found unseemly, though whether he said so directly or only privately is not recorded. What is documented is arsenic, in the bodies of at least 4 men, in the specimens collected by a Cook County physician in the spring of 1923. In the testimony of a toxicologist who told the court he had no difficulty identifying the compound, what is also documented, and this is what separates this case from an ordinary poisoning case, if such a thing can be called ordinary, are the predictions. Statements made openly, to neighbors, to relatives, sometimes to near strangers, that a particular man would die on a particular day. She was not wrong, not once, not until the 5th husband. That is where this account ends, with a man alive who was not supposed to be. To arrive at that ending, at the moment when a neighbor finally walked what she had heard to a doctor's office instead of a confessional, we have to go back to a block on Chicago's near northwest side, in the years when the city was still being assembled around the people it was consuming. The Chicago that received Tilly Gburek, the precise year of her arrival from Poland, is not certain. Somewhere in the late 1890s or the first years of the new century, was a city of neighborhoods so internally coherent they functioned, in practice, as separate countries. The Polish community that had settled in the corridor running northwest from the city center, along Milwaukee Avenue and its tributary streets, had reproduced something that felt, at its best, like the villages they had left. The same feast days, the same patterns of obligation and gossip, the same tight web of eyes that held a community together and made it, at the same time, extraordinarily difficult to leave. St. Mary of Perpetual Help anchored the spiritual life of the near southwest side's Polish population. Farther north and west, other parishes served as the institutional spine of neighborhoods whose streets were still being paved in the years before the First World War. The tenements on Tilly's block were 3-story affairs of dark Chicago brick, their windows close set, their hallways carrying always the smell of coal smoke and boiled cabbage and the particular animal warmth of several families living in close proximity through a Midwestern winter. The cold in those buildings arrived early and stayed. Ice formed on interior windowsills from November to March. Women wore their housecoats to the stove. The buildings breathed condensation. In this environment, the kitchen was not simply where food was prepared. It was the center of social life, the space where women gathered, where news traveled, where the work of maintaining a community, the watching and the feeding and the judging and the forgiving, was conducted. When a neighbor was ill, women came to the kitchen. When a husband died, women brought food to the kitchen. The kitchen was where things were known. It was also where Tilly Klimek spent most of her time. Her kitchen was, by the accounts of several neighbors later called to describe it in court, unremarkable. A cast-iron stove, a table with 4 chairs, though there was rarely anyone at it but herself and her husband. A shelf with jars. The jars are worth noting. They came up at trial. Her first husband's name appears in the documentary record as John Mitkiewicz, though the rendering varies. Immigrant names were transcribed by American clerks who heard them imprecisely and wrote them down worse, and no version of the name should be treated as authoritative. What is consistent across sources is his occupation, laborer. What the specific labor was, the records do not preserve. He was, by the testimony of neighbors who remembered him, a quiet man. Anna Wachowski, who would testify about the prediction, said he had a particular way of standing. Very straight, she said, even when he was leaning against a wall, even in repose, as though he had been trained to it young, and the posture had become involuntary. He and Tilly had been married for some years by 1914. The precise duration is not in the documents available. He grew sick in the autumn of that year, and the progression of his illness, as described by the women who visited, and the neighbors who noticed the change in him, was consistent with what investigators would later recognize as chronic arsenic poisoning. Vomiting, severe abdominal pain, progressive weakness in the limbs, a burning sensation in the hands and feet, hair that began to come away. These are not symptoms that announce their cause. They are symptoms that can be produced by a dozen different organic illnesses. By poor diet, by bad water, by the accumulated insults of industrial labor. In 1914, in a Polish immigrant tenement in Chicago, a man who showed these symptoms had nothing unusual wrong with him, except that he was dying, and that was usual enough. Anna Wachowski testified that one afternoon, several weeks before the end, Tilly came downstairs and sat at her kitchen table without an invitation. This was not unusual. Women moved between apartments freely and accepted the coffee that was offered, and then said in Polish something the translator rendered for the court as, "He will not last until the new year." Wachowski said she had asked whether Tilly had spoken to a doctor. "What would a doctor tell me?" Tilly said. "That I don't already know." "He died in December, before Christmas," Wachowski said. She was precise about this. There is a particular quality to the grief that a community performs for a woman who has lost a husband, and Tilly received it in full. The casseroles, the prayers, the evenings when women came and sat with her and asked nothing of her, and left when she seemed tired. Polish immigrant communities of that period were practiced in loss. They had crossed an ocean partly to escape the conditions that made early death routine, and had arrived in a city where different conditions made it routine again. The stockyards, the factories, the streets, the cold. The rituals of mourning were refined. They knew what to do when a man died. What they were not prepared for was the speed of what followed. By most accounts, Tilly remarried within months. The name of her second husband appears most consistently across sources as John Ruskowski, and that is how he appears in the retrospective newspaper coverage of 1923. He was a neighbor. The geography of these communities was such that most marriages occurred within a radius of a few blocks. He was approximately her age. Beyond this, the record is sparse. Ruskowski was not a man who left many traces, and the traces that exist were compiled after his death, which is its own kind of poverty. He was sick within a year of the marriage. The prediction Tilly made for him is documented through the testimony of Sophia Michalak, who described it at trial. A Sunday gathering, following church at someone's apartment, the specific occasion not precisely recalled. 5 or 6 women present. Tilly had been quiet. Then, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, she said it. "He will be gone by Easter." Michalak said there was a silence. "She said it," Michalak told the court, "like she was telling us the weather, and I thought she must be sensing something, because you hear of women who know things. My grandmother had something like that. She knew when people were going to go. He was gone by Easter. The insurance policy on John Ruskowski returned approximately $250. This is documented in the subsequent investigation. At the time, it was not documented by anyone. Life insurance was common. Widows collected. This was understood. Here, at a century's remove, it is easy to assign the credulity of the neighborhood as a failure of intelligence. And this would be wrong. It would also be lazy, and laziness is not a habit this account can afford. The women on that block, the ones who heard the predictions and wove them into their existing frameworks of folk knowledge and religious resignation, were not naive people. They were women who had negotiated immigration bureaucracies in a language not their own, who had managed household economies that allowed almost nothing for error, who had raised children in buildings that were cold and structurally indifferent to human survival. They were observant. They were, in the particular way of tight communities, expert readers of their environment. They noticed everything. They talked about what they noticed. What they possessed, along with their powers of observation, was a framework that rendered the predictions legible as something other than what they were. Polish folk tradition, like the folk traditions of most pre-industrial European cultures, carried within it a well-developed set of beliefs about women who could sense death approaching. The Znaczorka, the wise woman, the one in the village whose knowledge came from a source that lay outside the ordinary explanatory categories. Religion and folk belief had coexisted in rural Poland for centuries, not in conflict so much as in negotiation, each conceding territory to the other. The women of Tilly's neighborhood had grown up in that negotiation. They knew what a woman who sensed death looked like. They knew how such women spoke, the flatness of the register, the absence of apparent distress, the quality of someone reporting rather than predicting. Tilly looked like that, and the deaths. The deaths were real. The grief was real. The widowhood was real. Whatever was causing it, the community was not wrong that something was happening. They simply had the wrong explanation for what. The framework they held provided an explanation that was internally consistent, emotionally coherent, and required nothing of the witness. You cannot stop fate. You can only observe it, and bring food, and pray. The community observed. The community brought food. The community prayed. The smell of illness in those apartments, something sour and medicinal, a heaviness that clung to curtains and settled in the woodwork, was familiar enough to be unremarkable. The visits, the prayers, the small kindnesses of women who understood that a sick man needed tending. All of this was the community working exactly as it was supposed to work. It was working correctly in response to a situation it had misdiagnosed. Her third husband's name appears in the record as Frank Kupchik. He was, in approximately 1920, a man of about 50. The precise date of the marriage, like so many dates in this case, had to be reconstructed from records that were not assembled with any expectation of forensic scrutiny. He had worked in meat processing and in a small factory near Clybourne Avenue, the product of which is never specified in the available documents. He was, unlike Tilly, a sociable man. Several witnesses remembered him as someone who laughed easily and often, who laughed at things that other people in the room had not yet recognized as funny. He had a habit, one woman testified in a court deposition, of keeping wrapped sweets in his coat pocket for the children in the building. Not just his own building, but the buildings on either side. He always had something for them. The children called him by a name that was not his name, something affectionate and Polish, and he never corrected them. He married Tilly within a year of her second husband's death. He was sick within months. The prediction she made for Frank Kupchik is perhaps the most documented of the early forecasts, because it was made to the largest audience. A name day gathering, a celebration for someone on the block, though whose name day and at whose apartment is imprecisely recalled across the available testimony. Tilly was present and had been, by two accounts, quiet for most of the evening. Then she said it, not to anyone in particular, to the room. "My husband will not be alive in 6 weeks," she said. "I have seen it. I know it. One of the women present," She is referenced in the trial testimony, but does not appear under her own name in the available documents. Asked whether Tilly had considered consulting a physician. "Doctors don't know everything," Tilly said. 6 weeks. Approximately 6 weeks. Frank Kupchik died. The insurance policy paid out approximately $300. The question of what Tilly Klimek knew, and when she knew it, is the center of everything. It is also the question the trial did not fully answer, because trials are not designed to answer questions of interiority. They are designed to answer questions of fact. And the facts in this case were, eventually, clear enough. There are 2 ways to read the predictions, and the way you read them determines what kind of story this is. The first reading is the one the neighborhood maintained for years: that Tilly was a woman with an unfortunate sensitivity to death, that she attracted dying men, or that dying men attracted her, or that whatever gift she possessed recognized them in some way that was not available to ordinary perception. This reading made her pitiable. It explained within its own logic the succession of losses. It also conveniently required nothing further of anyone who held it. The second reading is the one a Cook County jury arrived at in 1923, that the predictions were not premonitions. They were scheduling. When Tilly said a man would die in 6 weeks, she knew he would die in approximately 6 weeks, because she was administering something that would kill him in approximately 6 weeks. Arsenic trioxide, the form of the compound most commonly found in rat poison preparations of the period, available at hardware stores across the city for a few cents, one of the most accessible poisons in an era before restricted sales and compulsory record-keeping, acts slowly in chronic doses. The nausea comes first, then the weakness, then the progressive failure of the body's systems as the compound accumulates. The timeline is not supernatural. It is pharmacological. It can be known in advance by anyone who knows what they are putting into the food. She was not predicting. She was announcing. What this means about Tilly Klimek's inner life is a question the record cannot adequately answer. She was not a diarist. No letters in her hand survive, or none that have been made available to researchers. What exists is testimony about her, what she said, how she moved, the expression on her face during the trial, the quality of her silences. On the question of whether she understood her own actions as murder, or had developed some other category for them, some rationalization sufficient to her own needs, the record is silent. What we can say is this: the predictions were made publicly. The insurance policies were purchased promptly. The arsenic was kept in the kitchen, in a jar on the shelf, in proximity to the stove. And after each death, Tilly Klimek recovered with the efficiency of a woman who had done this before, which, by the time of the third husband, she had. There is a moment in this story that is not in the trial record. It exists in the account of an unnamed visitor, reported to a Tribune journalist in the summer of 1923, after the arrest, when the neighborhood was reconstructing what it had been through. In the weeks following Frank Kupchik's death, Tilly received the customary visits. Women came. She fed them, because she was, by consistent account, an excellent cook. This was noted without irony by people who would later testify against her. The feeding was real. The hospitality was real. The warmth she showed in those afternoons, in that kitchen, was real enough that no one in the room thought to question it. At some point during one of these afternoon visits, a group of children from the building appeared at the door. 3 or 4 of them, asking for Panny Tilly, which was what they called her. The unnamed visitor said that Tilly's face changed when she heard them, that whatever composed and careful thing she had been presenting to her guests dissolved. She went to the door. She kneeled, with some difficulty because her knees were bad, and she was a stout woman, and the kneeling was not easy for her, to put herself at the children's level. She knew each child by name. She brought out small rolls from the bakery. She spoke to each one separately, quietly, in Polish, and the visitor said that the children went away happy. The visitor said she had found this moving, at the time. She said something else about it later that the journalist wrote down. Joseph Klimek was the fourth husband. He is the one whose name she kept. He was a man in his early 50s when they married, in approximately 1921. He had lived for some years in the same neighborhood or close to it. The geography of these blocks was intimate, and most of the people in Tilly's life had known her, in some capacity, for years. He was a neighbor. He had watched, from some proximity, at least one of the preceding deaths. He had heard the predictions, or some version of them, or heard about them from people who had. He married her anyway. There is a temptation to read this as a failure of judgment in Joseph Klimek, and perhaps it was that. It might equally be read as evidence of how thoroughly the community had absorbed the framework of misfortune. Tilly was not, in the neighborhood's understanding of her, a suspected poisoner. She was an unlucky woman. Being the next husband of an unlucky woman was a risk, perhaps, but not an unreasonable one. Men made riskier calculations every day, on the killing floor, on the scaffolding, in the currents of a city that offered mobility, and extracted a price for it. Tilly's unluckiness was visible and quantifiable. The world was full of dangers that were neither. He had, by several accounts, a specific quality of attentiveness toward others. He was the kind of man who noticed when a neighbor's coal had run low, and said something about it before being asked. He had a scar along the right side of his jaw. Its origin is not recorded in any document available, that gave his face, in certain lights, the expression of a man permanently on the verge of asking a gentle question. He married Tilly in the summer or early fall of 1921. By the following winter he was sick. The progression of Joseph Klimek's illness, as described by neighbors who visited, and by the physician who was called, too late and briefly to attend him, was consistent with what had come before. The stomach pain first, the inability to hold food, then the weakness in the legs, the tremor in the hands, the gray quality of the skin. One neighbor, a woman named Rosalia Cerny, said she visited Joseph in the last weeks of his illness and found him diminished in a way that was hard to describe, except to say that it did not look like illness. Precisely. It looked like erasure. She said his hands, which had been large and certain, looked like something left out in the weather. She had asked Tilly, standing in the kitchen while Joseph slept, "Is there anything that helps him?" Tilly was at the stove. She did not turn around. "Nothing helps," she said. "He'll be gone before the month is out." Rosalia Cerny said she had gone home and prayed. She said she had not thought to call anyone. He died before the month was out. The insurance policy on Joseph Klimek paid out slightly more than the others, $350, by the prosecution's accounting. The prediction had been made to at least 4 people. 4 people had heard it. 4 people had understood it as foreknowledge. 4 people had gone home. This is where the narrator must pause and acknowledge something.